So the candidates, their supporters, the Electoral Commission, INEC, and the security agencies, collectively, they could make a huge difference to who clinches victory in Saturday's presidential elections. On the final day of campaigning, several countries, including the US, have called on all parties to take a firm stand against violence and hate speech by their supporters. In Nigeria, of course, getting into politics can be a dangerous affair. Lots of unpleasant things can happen to you. And this US-led international appeal comes hours after the Labour Party's candidate for a Senate seat in Enugu in the southeast was shot dead, along with two of his colleagues. This presidential race is seen as the most competitive since the military handed back power in 1999. The head of the Electoral Commission, INEC, has been stressing his agency's commitment to ensuring credible elections.
The Commission is committed to free, fair, and credible elections in compliance with the electoral legal framework and the letter and spirit of the peace accord. All political parties and candidates are hereby reassured of the Commission's neutrality. INEC is not a political party. We have no candidate in the election. Our allegiance is to the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and our loyalty is to Nigerians.
That's Mahmood Yakubu, who is the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, or INEC. So on the final day of campaigning, ahead of Nigeria's most tightly contested presidential election in nearly 25 years, I'm joined now in the studio by the noted psephologist, professor of political science and development consultant, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, who's also a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja and chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
Just a few hours to go. How do you feel as we approach the front lines of this election?
I feel reassured actually, because there was a lot of fear that as the date approaches, desperation within the political class might lead to lots of actions that could precipitate a major crisis. It's not that there hasn't been problems, there have been, but I do feel that we should be confident enough that we'll actually go to the polls. Great achievement. INEC has actually been given some cash to pay for its logistics. And in this country, when anybody gets cash, these days is a major breakthrough, and you have to go and thank God. So things are going smoothly, I think. The peace accord reaffirmation, I think, is a key issue that will give confidence. And the candidates are really marching on this assumption that this is the most open election in the history of this country, and therefore they do have a chance, and they will take it to the very last.
So given everything you've just said, what do you expect from this election? An earthquake that will leave lots of rubble behind in terms of, victory, losses, and so on and so forth, or something less dramatic?
Well, I think it's likely to have a lot of drama, because in most previous elections, there will be two leading candidates, and you can work out who is going to win that election. This time, those of us who are pundits and sincere will say we have no idea who would win this election. And I think that's very good. It means it's an open election. It means any of the leading candidates could win. And it prepares Nigerians, I think, for the reality of elections, which is you can do all the polling you want, but the real action is taken by voters on election day. So we look forward in anticipation to what decisions Nigerian voters will take and present to us the surprise of 2023.
Yes, and you mentioned the voters. I mean, do you expect that there'll be room for the voices of the people, those voters, to be heard by way of a free and credible election? Can they reclaim their power to choose their leaders, which some would argue they've lost in previous elections?
I think for me, I feel very confident that the choices made by voters will count. The Electoral Act 2022 has really improved the conditions for the integrity of the elections. The use of technology that has grown has made a real difference. INEC has shown a lot of foresight for this election. And I think IREC, the fact that from every polling unit, the results of that polling unit will be transmitted to a public portal where everybody can sit at home and check to see that the results counted in the polling unit where he or she is what's reflected on the public portal will all have access to. This means the type of a black box that used to exist in collation centers, where everybody knows the results at the polling units, and you go to a collation center and magic happens, trends change, and suddenly you have an unexpected outcome. That's not going to happen this time. So I think voters should have the confidence that indeed this is one election in our history where my choice as a Nigerian citizen will make a difference in terms of outcomes.
And of course, the think tank that you're closely associated with, the Center for Development and Democracy and Development, is a well-respected election analysis think tank. Has the CDD developed particular ways in the context of what you were just telling us to analyze this ballot and whether or not, propriety took place and votes will count and all the rest of it?
Oh yes, we just launched our election analysis center here at the Hilton this morning. We are deploying 5,000 observers in all states of the Federation, and we've put together a formidable group of 15 top analysts in this country to be analyzing issues as they roll out. In the press conference we had today, we drew attention to the major issues that define the dynamics of these elections, and we believe that those 5 issues, the 5 R's we call them, are what will determine how these elections will take place.
And would you care to let us know what those 5 R's are?
Yes, we call them the 5 I's. The first is the identity politics. Elections in Nigeria is not an election if identity politics doesn't play into it. It's very much part of this election. We take our identities very seriously. There are manipulations of identities, and it's going to be a factor. The second I we spoke about is that of insecurity. There's insecurity in many parts of this country at this point in time. We feel there has been some progress in tackling it, but it remains a very serious problem in many of the local governments. And we did a study on insecurity that drew attention to the local governments where the level of security will present real challenges to the elections. The third is the key institutions. And here we mean INEC, which is the main player in the elections, the security agencies, and of course voters organizing their communities. They all need to play their role, and if they play their role appropriately, then the outcome will be good. The fourth one has to do with the information disorder, especially in this social media. But one of the specificities of this election is that fake news, dangerous speech, hate speech in the social media has traveled to the traditional media, and there's a lot of manipulation of people's emotions emanating from that, and we feel that's a key factor. And the final of the 5 R's has to do with both inter-party and this time intra-party squabbles within the players themselves, who are the political parties. And it's fascinating to see the president fighting with governors from his own party, for example, or in the case of PDP, the Gang of Five fighting their presidential candidate. We've never had such deep intra-party squabbles as we have this time.
Well, that's very interesting indeed. So 5 cardinal things that the CDD, in its electoral analysis wisdom, reckons will cast potentially a dark gloom over this election, or could.
Yes.
And is there a barometer for measuring public opinion in these final hours? Is there an indication of which presidential candidate might have majority support in sections of the country?
Well, we feel that one of the things about these elections is a state of flux. In the last 4 weeks, candidates that have had strong support in one zone in the country have seen their support diminish, and the support of other candidates that were low go up. And this has been one of the main reasons why it's very difficult to make any scientific prediction about the results. The dynamics are always changing, and the drama of the nation, for example, the currency change, which has been a huge drama over the past 4 months, have molded and changed opinion among very many voters. And what we are noticing is that those opinions have switched in one direction and sometimes have switched back to where they were originally, as people interpret and reinterpret who is behind this currency change, what is its real purpose beyond the issue of monetary policy.
So is it your sense then that this ongoing cash crisis is likely to have an effect on this election?
Oh, definitely it will have an effect, because people are reaching conclusions in terms of what was the policy intended for. Because in this country, there's always the formal intention of a policy, but people sit back and say, wait a minute, maybe what we are being told officially is not the reality of what's behind the policy. There will be ulterior motives. Let's search what those motives are, and based on that, reach our conclusion on what's happening.
Right, but could it actually stop people from going out to vote? Or on the other hand, just listening to what you're saying just now, could the anger generated by the cash crisis encourage people to go to the polls to put a government in power that they hope won't bring these kinds of hardships on them in the future?
It's working both ways. One way it's working is that many people have no access to cash at this time. Those who have to travel to vote would be unable to vote. So it will have the negative effect of reducing the ability of people to go to where they are registered to vote. The other one has to do with their interpretation of motives I've spoken about. Some people who believe, for example, that a candidate from a particular part of the country is the victim of this currency change, and therefore they want to use the unpopularity of the policy to affect the votes of that person negatively, who may not have had 80% of support in that zone. Suddenly people will realize, oh, if they want to bring down a person, then we'll come out more to support the person, just to frustrate that other perception that somebody is behind him. And of course, the impact of this interpretation will differ as you move from zone to zone. But one key issue is that all over the country, there is a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration over this. People are not convinced with the policy explanation given by government, and they feel they are targeted as Nigerians who have money in the banks and can't access their money, and that whatever is said is really irrelevant in terms of their lives. Their money has been confiscated by a state that's refusing to give it back to them.
And I mean, you mentioned in those 5 I's that you pointed out earlier, the intra-party squabbles, the internecine fighting. Is there a more defined sense, for example, in the APC, of whether President Buhari has, by his actions, picked a side in this election beyond the few appearances he's made and the brief words he's uttered in support of the APC presidential candidate, Bola Tinubu? Because many in his party seem to believe that he's been trying to undermine that support.
Well, clearly the party chairman has himself made that clear, that that policy is designed against the candidate of their party. Most of the governors of the APC have also made that argument. And if therefore key players within the ruling APC feel that the president has designed this against their own candidate, then that's a strong point. I don't really think President Buhari has somebody in mind in proposing this policy. He said over and over again that his legacy he wants to present is to make sure that the elections are credible. He has made it clear, but also the chair of the EFCC, that they know specifically certain governors have accumulated huge war chests to buy votes, and that they know where those monies are. So there's a real policy dimension to the move made by the presidency. And when you look at the reactions, I think there are two sets of reactions. One, people who feel they are directly impacted by the policy are responding on the basis that their objectives are being scuttled. But the other dimension is that just ordinary Nigerians who need cash for their daily survival needs feel deprived and are therefore talking in personal capacities as citizens who live in a country where, very strange for this to happen, people have no access to money.
So on the political level, I mean, do you get the sense that, you know, he is obviously a member of the APC, and the expectation would be that he would be fully and overtly in support of his candidate, the candidate of the party? Do you get the sense that he's played quite a clever line and has tried to stay, to some extent, non-aligned?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, he has attended some of the presidential campaign rallies of the APC and therefore made public his support for the candidate. Some have argued he hasn't attended enough. We remember when
his statements have been very brief.
Yes, very brief statements. When Obasanjo was campaigning for Eradua, for example, he was actually the star of the whole campaign and was at every rally. So President Buhari hasn't shown that level of enthusiasm, but he has been there and he has made public commitments of support. But this is where the whole issue of the reality of politics comes in. A lot of people feel that he's just putting up a front, that that's the public action to cover up an undermining process that he has set in motion. I don't have any specific access to information on what side the truth lies on, but I think what's important for us is that at the political front, people are responding on the basis of that understanding, but that's also happening at the level of voters. And voters are beginning to change their decisions on who to vote for, on the interpretations they make on what's happening.
Right, and we've got a couple of minutes or so left. On the back of that analysis, very interesting, by the way, that you just made, I mean, we could say that Nigerians have become used to, over the years, you know, since perhaps, well, more recently, used to a two-horse race in presidential elections. Is having a third and possibly fourth front-runner candidate likely to inspire a larger turnout?
I think it would. Not so much because there are four leading candidates, but because people feel the stakes are very high. I think this is one election that is being run on the agenda of competence. The view of most voters is that the last 8 years have demonstrated incompetence at the level of the elected government of the Federation, and that people feel that was a mistake, that in 2015 and 2019 they may have voted more for emotive reasons than for rational reasons of who will serve them best in governance. So there is an attempt at this point for people to sit down and reflect who are the best candidates, not just at the presidential level, but also at the lower levels. In northern Nigeria, for example, one principle that has collapsed is what they call the SAK principle, SAK, which came up in 2015. And basically it means let all of us vote as a community. And now the consensus is, no, you can't do SAK principle, for the simple reason that this party may present a good one for governor, but not for the presidency. So study each candidate individually, identify the most competent among them, and vote for those people. And that, I think, is a huge progress in our political culture.
Absolutely extraordinary. Thank you very much indeed. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is a noted psephologist, professor of political science and development consultant, senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development in Abuja, and chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's premium Times newspaper. Thank you ever so much.